Hello, Rodney. I'm Jeremy Lonsdale, and what we're going to talk about is my book, A Game Emerging: Yorkshire Cricket Before the Coming of the All England 11, which was published earlier this year, and it's the fourth in a series that ACS has published on different periods of the history of Yorkshire cricket. So the first one was a game taken seriously, which covers the Victorian period, really, up to the 1890s. And then I wrote a book on the First World War, the impact of the First World War on cricket in Yorkshire at all levels. And then a couple of years ago, A Game Divided, which looks at Yorkshire in the 1920s. So A Game Emerging is the fourth, and actually, having touched on the 1920s, I then went right back to the very beginning. So the book that we're going to talk about today is it covers the period from the earliest references to Yorkshire, the earliest recorded references to Yorkshire cricket, which is in the 1750s, right through to the arrival of the famous all-star All England 11, William Clark's All England 11, and they first played in Yorkshire. Well, they first played anywhere in 1846, and they played in Sheffield, Leeds, and Manchester in 1846. So it covers that sort of 100-year period, and it's an attempt really to make sense of that early period, which has been largely ignored in the history books. Certainly it's often skimmed over very quickly. So when people talk about the history of cricket in Yorkshire, they usually refer to the establishment of Yorkshire County Cricket Club in 1863. But actually, an awful lot went on before 1863, which shouldn't really be skimmed over in just a few pages. Or people talk about 1833, which was when Yorkshire played Norfolk, which is regarded as the sort of first county match. But the question then is, well, why was it played in 1833? What was happening in cricket in Yorkshire in those days that led to that match being played? You know, these things don't just sort of come out of nowhere. And I think what I've tried to sort of do in the book is to sort of emphasize the point that at this stage of the development of the game of cricket in the country, but in Yorkshire in particular, all cricket's local. You know, it's important to look at what's happening in towns and villages to understand how the game is growing. And you know, there has been a fair amount written about cricket in Sheffield in the early years, in the 1820s and 1830s and so on. And there's no doubt that the cricket in Sheffield was strong, and it was the strongest in Yorkshire. But far less has been written about other parts of the county. And Sheffield didn't sort of operate on its own. So you know, what I wanted to sort of understand, how did what we know about Sheffield cricket fit into that wider picture? So the book is based on the material that's available to us more than 200 years on. So a lot of that is newspapers, which many of which are now digitized, and so it's possible to trawl through them reasonably easily. There is some archive material. I found a wonderful scorebook from a side in Beverley, which starts in 1825, which is very interesting. Mostly just scores, but actually also some lovely little annotations and quips from the scorer, which give some insights into the game. And there's other documents like that, but not many. They're few and far between. Although what is nice, and it's actually on the front cover of the book, is a ball which is nearly 200 years old, which was used in the match in which the famous Sheffield player Tom Marsden scored over 200 which is obviously in the context of the 1820s a quite ridiculously large score. And it's amazing that the not only the ball but actually the scorebook both still exist. They're in a museum in Sheffield. So so that's really the book, and basically the argument of the book is that the All England 11, when it arrived in 1846, it was a really important turning point for the game in Yorkshire, and indeed it's a big deal for the game in England. But the argument in my book is that the game in Yorkshire was more developed than was previously portrayed. Sheffield was preeminent, but the game was also reasonably strong elsewhere. And I also emphasize in the book, and there's a big chapter about this, that the turning point for me in the development of the game was the 1830s. And we can talk about that later. I mean, the 1830s just seems to be a really pivotal point, and the game really kicks on from that point. On into the 1840s, we see the development of the game. But what I set out in the book, and the sort of argument, is that actually progress with cricket in Yorkshire was slowed by a lack of leadership, a lack of money in the game, and insufficient quality players. And that what was really sort of significant about the All England 11 was the fact that they built on existing enthusiasm and they provided fresh momentum for the game, and we can talk about that later.
Would you say a bit about the factors or forces or social conditions unique to the development of cricket in Yorkshire, how they influenced that development, and how that development was distinct from the progress of the game in the South?
Yeah, I mean, traditionally, the history of the game in the 18th century in England and early 19th century has focused on the southeast and London in particular, and it's talked a lot about the role of fashionable aristocratic society on the development of the game. And I think, to a large extent, the north of England is ignored, and it's not seen to have had any great cricket of great merit worth reporting, or indeed whether there is much evidence of the cricket available. And so I think if you look at the images of 18th century cricket, and a lot of the histories, the images are all around fashionable games in London and the South. They're all about Hambledon and so on, and also the importance of cricket for betting purposes, and then the sort of significance of the development of the laws of the game and so on, to allow for reasonably fair and honest matches. I think it's quite difficult to get a sense of developments in the very early developments in Yorkshire. You get first small references in the newspapers to the game in the 1750s, but they are really tiny snippets. They are also not necessarily to do with the game in Yorkshire. They're reporting on matches in the southeast, which I guess the editors of the newspaper, they were either using them as fillers or they thought that their readers might be interested. So in terms of how did the game sort of emerge in Yorkshire, I guess a lot of this is just sort of supposition and sort of guesswork. I think there's a few factors really. I think it was almost certainly in some places seeded by people who had travelled to the south of England and who had sort of been exposed to the game. So there's an interesting little story at the beginning of the book about a gentleman who lived in Ripon in Yorkshire. And he had been educated in the south of England. We're talking now in the 1730s, and he'd been exposed to cricket there, and he enjoyed it. And he had a son, and he took his son down to Sevenoaks in 1744, and they both had bats made for themselves. And they came back and they played, and they presumably played on a regular basis. And then on one occasion, they appear to have put the bats on the top of a bookcase, in the family home. These were, wealthy people who could afford to travel and obviously could afford to travel to the south of England. Anyway, they put the bats on the top of the bookcase and presumably forgot about them. And at some point, the bats fell behind the back of the bookcase, which was screwed to the wall. And it wasn't until the family home was sold in the 1990s that this bookcase was taken off the wall, and suddenly these two pristine cricket bats from the 1740s were discovered, and they were sold at auction. This is the only reason I know about this, because they were sold at auction. And that's a really nice, interesting story, and it made me wonder about the idea of this gentleman, and there must have been others who were perhaps did the same sort of thing. They were exposed to the game in the south of England. They were attracted to it. They brought it back. Maybe they were seen by other people, by their friends, and so on. And in that sort of small way, the game might have been diffused. I think the other sort of people who travelled around the country and might have been exposed to it at the time were the military. It's interesting that some of the early references to cricket in Yorkshire involve the military. And so, for example, on the east coast of Yorkshire in the 1790s, there was fear of French invasion, and so there was quite a lot of troops stationed along the east coast. And so some of the matches do involve soldiers. So again, I wonder whether or not the sort of people who had the opportunity to travel, which most people didn't at this time. Most people would stay relatively close to where they lived, but perhaps that was one of the ways. I think you start to get more references in the local newspapers. You get references to not just aristocratic cricket matches from the south of England, but also local matches. This is in newspapers, say, published in Leeds or in Sheffield, and so on. So I think the important thing about those references are, first of all, they don't appear to be, the early references don't appear to be the first ones. It's not like there's some kind of explanation in that report to say, there's this game called cricket, and it's played like this. It's sort of taken for granted. So I think the implication, the conclusion I draw from that is that the references that were made that appear in these newspapers, they're not about the first games in those places. So I think it's got a slightly longer history. And I think also, as I say, no sort of need to explain the game, which suggests that there might have been some familiarity with it. I think by the 1780s and 1790s also, Leeds newspapers have got adverts for prints of cricket matches in the south of England, which I don't think those would have been advertised if people hadn't a clue what they depicted. Rules of the game available for sale. So you also see in the 1760s there are one or two diaries of people writing about spending time in Leeds and seeing groups of sort of young men playing cricket, and it being seen as a sort of fun, respectable activity. So I think those sort of, the diffusion of the game probably came about through individuals, probably came about through the sort of spread of newspapers, probably came about through changes really in Yorkshire society. And I think you have to sort of take a step back, as I've tried to do in the book, in the opening chapter, and talk about developments in the economy and society in Yorkshire. And it was distinct from London. London was just very wealthy, and there were lots of influential people there. It was fashionable, and London fashions took a long time to disperse out to the provinces. But I think the spread of newspapers in the 18th century, provincial newspapers, which carried an awful lot of information, a lot of adverts. I think they played a role in spreading the word about all sorts of things. I think we see improved communications in the north of England in the 18th century. Canals, improved roads. Quite interesting looking at sort of stagecoach timetables on the front of newspapers, and sort of seeing actually quite how well connected certain places were by the turn of the 19th century. You could move about. It wasn't necessarily easy, and it certainly wouldn't have been cheap. So it was way beyond what many people could afford. But these things were happening, and I think it's those kind of factors which allow people to move about and make connections and see. There's just I guess changes in society. Also things like improvements to lots of sort of market towns becoming quite sort of lively hubs and people moving about more and coming into contact with other people. And I think these sorts of things are a background to something like cricket as a sport, just spreading and people seeing it and thinking actually, that's an interesting way or an enjoyable way, fun way of spending time. So, I think there's a sort of spread of new ideas in the late 18th century, and these things are slowly sort of diffusing their way up to the north of England, and I do think that's quite a significant factor in the development of cricket. I think the only caveat to a lot of this is, of course, in the end, we only know what is left to us, and the sort of references to early cricket from the 1750s onwards, right through to, I would say, right through to the early 19th century. I mean, these are pretty small. They're not many references, and we just don't know how representative they are. The kind of matches that we're talking, the sort of organised cricket that we see referred to, we just have no idea whether those are typical sort of matches. They could be, but they could just be that they are matches played by better off people, more influential people, the kind of people who were reported about, the kind of people who thought it was worth bothering to alert somebody that they'd played this game of cricket against a team down the 10 miles away or whatever.
That's an excellent point. One a great many historians aren't alive to. There's a tendency to assume that the record we have is the equivalent of carbon-dated artifacts. The game itself changed remarkably during the period under review, both legally and socially. It looked very different to the way it looks today. Perhaps you'd tell us how. Give us a sketch of the game.
I think what you've just said is a really important point. I think we have to sort of treat the material that's left to us 250 years on with a certain amount of skepticism, and we have to kind of accept that it's very, very, very patchy. I mean, most cricket that was played was impromptu and would go unrecorded. It was just people enjoying themselves with a few friends. And so, the game was a sort of, it was a folk game, which was probably played in all kinds of different sort of styles and with sort of basic different rules. I mean, I think Eric Midwinter in his recent book Four Epochs talks about this, that it's hard in his view. It's hard before the sort of 1830s, 1840s to sort of think of cricket as a sort of single distinct activity. I'm not entirely convinced by that argument, but I think the point is certainly the case. In the 18th century, there must have been, variations on it, and people wouldn't have slavishly adhered to the laws of cricket, even if they were aware that there were any, or indeed that this was necessary. The evidence that when I'm talking now about the late 18th century and the early 19th century, I mean I'm talking based on the evidence that I've seen. A lot of the games, the sort of more organised games, and those that were reported, were played on common land. They were played on moorland. They were played, in some cases, Doncaster Racecourse, for example, was somewhere where sort of more fashionable cricket matches were played at the beginning of the 19th century. think the important thing, probably the theme here, is these were matches played away from towns. They were in open space, where players presumably hoped that they wouldn't be interrupted, and they would just get away from other people and play a game which needed a certain amount of space. And it needed a certain amount of flat space as well. So race courses were probably a good idea. They could find a flat piece of moorland, and common land, and maybe they just those were the sort of places that people kind of got together anyway. So that was a natural place to play cricket. So the more organised games, they were pretty small scale affairs. I suspect a lot of the time they were just kind of groups of friends getting together. So the idea of a cricket club is probably a bit grandiose. There were some cricket clubs, but I think probably most games were played by groups of friends. They were probably played either amongst themselves or against people who did not live that far away. So not too much travel. Although there are some interesting exceptions. I think there's an interesting match was played in the early 1770s in Yorkshire. Between two places that were about 30 odd miles apart, and I thought, well, that's very interesting. Why was that? And it's quite a long way to travel for a game. And then I noticed that both of them were very close to the Great North Road, and so you did one, and actually the place that they played was halfway between the two places, and you start to think about how connections between places which look quite a long way apart. Maybe that was it was natural to sort of travel along that particular road, and relationships built up, and people challenged each other and so on. Moving up a sort of a level, I think there are quite well organised clubs even in the later 18th century, and so we've got in R.S. Holmes' History of Yorkshire. From 1833 to 1903, he includes photograph of a document from York, which I think are the first rules of a cricket club that we've got, 1786. And I think what's very interesting there is how prescriptive those rules are. So the players had to meet every Tuesday at 4 o'clock in the morning on the moor. Until the 5th of September. They had paid a penny to do this, but they would be fined 3 pennies if they were not within the sight of the wickets when York Minster struck 5 o'clock. So this is very, very specific. And interesting, they also had, they had a secretary and they had a treasurer and so on. So it gives quite an interesting insight into, for some people playing cricket in the late 18th century, it was quite well organised. I think in terms of the actual play, low scores, slow play, slow batting, often sort of multiple innings, often 2 innings match, but actually sometimes 3 innings matches, and that's I think a reflection of the low scores. If you're going to spend a day playing cricket, then you don't want it to be all over within an hour or two.
The idea of losing a match by 2 innings is terrifying, frankly, though.
It is, but I think probably having made the effort to get together, you want to play cricket, so people were going, matches where people were going in for a third time. Lots of sort of local challenges, and I think as time goes on as well, what you see is the importance of the challenges being really specific, and I think it's about sort of specifying the boundary from which people could choose players. So one village would challenge another village. And they'd say, from people had to live within, say, 4 miles of the village. What they didn't want was, outsiders being brought in who were good at
given men, as it were.
Given men, as we sort of refer to them from the sort of 1850s onwards, but trying to sort of be very specific about who could be involved. And also in some of the more organised games, making sure that nobody who had any connection with the MCC would be involved. So really trying to sort of do that, and very specific about the money that was at stake, and so on. Who could and couldn't play, and what was the game for. I've tried to sort of speculate a little bit about who was playing these games, because it's not easy. I mean, a little bit later on in the sort of 1820s, you do actually get scorecards in newspapers which have the full name of individuals. And certainly in some villages, it's then possible to sort of, try and track these individuals, looking at the census information or the sort of parish registers. And I mean, that is a massive job, and I think it would be fascinating to be able to do that. I did do it with a few teams, and you got a bit of a sense of quite a mixed range of people. I get a sense that quite a lot of the sort of more organised cricket was played by people who had sort of probably self-employed, or people with sort of independent means, people, shopkeepers, some tradesmen, people who could afford to take time off during the day, and people who had discretion over their time. And I think particularly in, say, some of the market towns in Yorkshire and in some of the villages, I think that was a factor, that a lot of those that could organise their working week in order to take time off were able to sort of participate in this kind of activity. I think the other interesting thing is you do get I mean, I think by and large we're talking about very sort of low level organization. Maybe matches are played on a regular basis between certain places, and that sort of builds up over time. I think there are a few much better organized clubs. I mean, Ripon is one, and there's a lovely description from 1810 of the clothing that the Ripon team played in, and they had their own white cricket coats, and what were described as calico pantaloons, and they had they wore woolen pumps bound in Morocco, and this was their sort of standard uniform. And you do get one or two other clubs which did at this time have their sort of cricket uniform, and they had sort of trimmings of different colour to sort of designate their team. I think there are other clubs. I mean, Hull, for example, in the first decade of the 19th century, there's a club in Hull which it has a treasurer, it has a bank account, it has audited accounts. So I think most cricket is not like this, but there are the sort of the beginnings of well-organized clubs and formal clubs. And going back to Ripon, I mean, Ripon's interesting because there is a book that was published, and I think Holmes refers to it and describes it as the first bit of Yorkshire cricket related book published, and I think it was published in the 1830s. But it's a sort of a record of every match that the Ripon club had played in the sort of previous 20 years, with sort of descriptions and so on. So I think the game was largely informal, but I think by the beginnings of the 19th century, I think you get that the sort of the title of my book is A Game Emerging, and I think you start to see the sort of beginnings of cricket in Yorkshire emerging in certain places. You get a certain amount of aristocratic support for different clubs, probably not on the same scale as down in the south of England, but you do get that. One thing I wanted to just sort of add, in sort of to finish off on this, on your point here, is probably the two most interesting things I found in the course of the work that I did for this book were two newspaper articles from 20 or 30 years later, but both of which sort of compared the cricket of the 1830s to the cricket of the 1760s. So this is normally we just have to kind of interpret change, and we have to interpret what things were like for ourselves. But actually, this is two kind of people from 200 years ago actually looking back at at the game from 60 years prior to their observations. And the first one comes from 1829, and in 1829, Sheffield Wednesday travelled to Ripon to play cricket, and this was the first time Sheffield side had travelled to the north of Yorkshire. This is a longer distance than normal, and it was quite interesting. There's an article in the Sheffield Independent newspaper by a reporter who went with the team, and it was obviously very a fairly patronising article, because and I'm just going to read a few lines of this, because he talks about the match between Sheffield Wednesday and Ripon, and he says, he says, in style, the style of the Ripon men proved to be the ugliest in England, and he says, but it was not without effect. They handled the club as Tom Warsop did when he was a little boy, and are in truth the cricketers of 60 years ago. So this is 1829, so he's kind of looking back to the 1860s. Notwithstanding, they are nothing to look at. They contrived to make some good straight hits and met a treacherous round ball as if they were not aware of the danger. And then he talks about the fact that in bowling, it must be admitted, though their manner is old and plain, it must not be despised. They know nothing of finesse, but they were usually at the mark or thereabouts. So it was quite a sort of contemptuous, the sort of sophisticated Sheffield, man from the city, having seen 10 years of development of cricket in Sheffield, goes out to a much more rural area further north in the county, and he sees his players playing against this team, and they as he puts it, in truth they are cricketers of 60 years ago. So I think it's interesting from the point of view, it's quite clear that there were developments and that people were aware that there were developments, and it also shows that there were sort of pockets of different practice, and that certain parts of the county, simply hadn't developed in the same way. And the second article was a little bit later, 1838, and again from the same newspaper in Sheffield, and it was an interesting match between two teams of men over 60. So this was 1838. Two teams of players who were in their 60s and 70s. So these were people who had played probably at the back end of the 18th century, and quite a long description, so I won't read it all. But it talks about, it says, the former could not fail to notice and be highly amused with the contrast between the old and the new methods of play as exhibited in the bowling, batting and placing of the field, while it would bring back to the mind of the latter many pleasing and we hope not many painful reminiscences. The game was played quite in the old style. There were the slow bowling and the blocking, snipping and on-hitting which our fathers have seen exhibited in many a well-contested match. In the setting out of the field also, there were the extra men, and on the offside, about 6 yards from the batter in the direction of the modern mid-wicket man, was fixed the all-important wicket tenter. The improved system of the present day would render the situation of this player anything but an enviable one. And then it says, and it's going back to the sort of reference to the uniforms, it says, among the players we noticed several who wore green jackets bound with red, which we understand was the regular uniform of the old Bent's Green Club, and certainly the wearers of them on this occasion did not disgrace their club. So again, an interesting sort of description, which if you unpack it, it's quite clear that there were observable differences between the way in which the players, the older players, men in their 60s and 70s, the way in which they conducted the game compared with what a writer in 1838 saw as the modern game. So I think those are quite insightful articles, and it gives you a sense of both change over time, but also a difference between different parts of Yorkshire.
Yorkshire, of course, is and was an enormous county, certainly in cricketing terms, with a range of competing hubs and headquarters, which, of course, in later years created some awkwardness for the county cricket club. You lay a particular emphasis on the role of Sheffield in the 1820s.
Yeah, I mean, Sheffield is actually totally crucial, absolutely crucial to the development of cricket in Yorkshire in the 19th century. I think until the 1820s, get the impression that although it was important and was further progressed in terms of the development of the game there than elsewhere, it wasn't sort of that much further. The first references, well, many of the first references to Yorkshire cricket are from the 1750s and 1760s, and they are from Sheffield. And there are important early games with Nottingham in the early 1770s, although none until after that, until 1800. And there are references to the Hallam Club, for example, in 1805, and even references to sort of factory matches in Sheffield. So the game was clearly being played, and in fact, also I came across obituaries of one or two players in the 1830s and 1840s, and there were references to the fact that they had been well known in Sheffield local cricket at the turn of the century. So there was quite a lot of the game being played. But the 1820s is really the sort of absolute turning point. I mean, there's sort of step change in the game in the county, and it's vitally important in terms of the development of a sort of commercial cricket. It's a real turning point for Yorkshire cricket. I mean, Sheffield was modernising in the first decades of the 19th century, and an awful lot of work was being done to make it quite a bustling place, and it had good contacts, good connections with the rest of the county, and also with Nottingham and Leicester and so on. There was an awful lot of pressure on land and space for all sorts of things as a result of all the house building and sort of factory building and so on. So quite a sort of dynamic place. And what we see in the 1820s is several entrepreneurs sort of opening commercial cricket grounds in Sheffield at Darnall. Firstly in 1822, the old ground, and then the new ground in 1824. Then the opening of Hyde Park, and also other smaller grounds, sort of local grounds. And I mean, these are interesting. These were sort of commercial cricket grounds, enclosed grounds. They were used most days of the week during the summer for cricket. And these were opened by people who saw an opportunity to make money out of the game. So they could charge people to watch the game. They could also charge people during the week to play sort of impromptu matches. And so you see adverts for if you want to come and play cricket, probably hire out equipment as well. So come along with your friends, and then of course there was refreshments available, and these became places where people could visit on a regular basis, and they could play and they could meet their friends and so on. So we're talking here about people like George Steer, a local businessman, and Hyde Park was opened by two men called Wright and Hazelhurst, and the suggestion, in fact, is that they spent about £4,000 opening the Hyde Park ground, which went really from the 1830s, became a big venue in English cricket. And what we then see from the middle of the 1820s is some quite major matches played on these grounds, at Darnall and then at Hyde Park. There was a regular match with Nottingham, but in 1825 All England played against Sheffield. There was also in 1827 All England played against Sussex in one of the famous games, which was designed to sort of test the new style of bowling. Sheffield was the first of those three games. You see matches against Leicester. You see All England playing against a combined Yorkshire, Leicestershire and Nottinghamshire side. And some of these matches attracted, according to reports, up to sort of 20,000 people. So this is a totally different scale of cricket and type of cricket, and it is really bears no comparison with the sort of local game that we've been talking about. And the professionals were brought in from the south of England to help coach local players and to improve the standard of play. We also see the building of proper pavilions, which are completely beyond the what we've seen before, and indeed there's nothing comparable elsewhere in Yorkshire. So I guess really by the end of the decade, Sheffield is very much locked into the sort of mainstream of English cricket, and connected to it. Hyde Park is seen as one of the best grounds in the country, and you're starting to see certain Sheffield players playing in the big matches in London. So the most famous is Thomas Marsden, and who, as I mentioned earlier, he scored a double century, 227 back in 1826, and this obviously is a remarkable score for the time. I don't think it was the highest, but it was certainly, I think it was second or third highest at the time. And he starts to be included in matches in London. James Dearman is another, and also Woolhouse. And I think it raises the profile of Yorkshire cricket. It raises and it gives a bit of a sense that there is significant cricket being played in the north of England. Famously, Marsden challenges any man in England to play him at single wicket cricket. He does that in 1828, and it isn't until 1833 that Pilch and he play, and Marsden loses that. But it was a sign of sort of confidence that had grown in Sheffield during the period, and I mean, it was referred to as a sort of contest to decide the cricketing championship between the north and the south of England. So I think Sheffield in the 1820s is really a turning point for Yorkshire cricket. Puts the north of England very much on the map. I think the problem, of course, is that actually they really struggle to make these grounds pay, and so both Darnall and Hyde Park are used for quite a lot of other things, just to try and make some money. But I think the important point is that Sheffield is sort of preeminent in Yorkshire cricket at this time. The game was growing, but I think and I have devoted a chapter to Sheffield, but I also devoted a chapter to developments of the game elsewhere in Yorkshire, and I think it's important to recognise that the game was growing elsewhere, albeit not at the same pace. And a lot of the sort of factors that were in place in Sheffield, the existence of the sort of commercial side to the game, they just didn't exist anywhere else in Yorkshire. So Woodhouse Moor in Leeds and the racecourse at York are kind of two significant cricket grounds in the north of England. But both of them are open grounds, and so there's interesting reports in the early 1830s to the cricket ground, the cricket pitches on Woodhouse Moor, which were sort of carved out by individual clubs. They were also used by the cavalry for exercising their horses, and so you can imagine what impact the hoofs had on the field. And so there's just no real comparison between those and the commercial grounds in Sheffield. Cricket was much more parochial, I think, away from Sheffield. A lot of the cricket that was played in Leeds in the 1820s was just between different Leeds sides, and there were no enclosed grounds. There was probably, I get the sense, there was quite a lot of sort of aristocratic support for and sort of more genteel support for cricket in different other parts of Yorkshire. So there was quite a sort of quite distinct from the sort of the money making and the sort of commercial side to the game that was very, very prominent in Sheffield. But what you do get is other parts of the county and clubs in other towns, building up reputation. So Ripon, Knaresborough, places right as far north as Yarm, Tadcaster. These all sort of claimed at one point or another in the 1820s to be sort of preeminent clubs apart from Sheffield, and that was one of the interesting things. There was often challenges made by these other clubs. We will take on anybody bar Sheffield. The sense being that Sheffield is something which is, we just can't even think about that. So there's quite a lot of local rivalries. I think you've got sort of perhaps a two-pace development. You've got Sheffield, what was going on in Sheffield in the 1820s, and then you've got a game which was emerging reasonably strongly, but nothing like on the same pace as Sheffield elsewhere.
You spoke just now about the 1820s as a turning point, but the decade following was pretty significant too. You speak of it as a decisive decade for the development of cricket in the county. Why was that?
Yeah, and I think I don't think it's a surprise that it's the longest chapter in the book, because I do think the 1830s is a decisive decade for the development of cricket, not just in Yorkshire but also in the country. I think it's an interesting time. It's a period when we start to see ever more serious attempts to sort of clamp down on some of the more barbaric traditional sports that English society had sort of enjoyed, if that's the right word, for a long time. The sort of chaotic football matches that took place, and sort of more barbaric sports involving animals. And you see quite a lot of efforts to clamp down on that. And I think it's in that sort of context that cricket, for many people, has a sort of an appeal. For some, it's a sort of very modern activity that's it's not associated with this sort of barbarism and violence, and so it's sort of seen very positively for that reason. Actually, interestingly, for others people, it's seen as a sort of return to English traditions at a time of great social change and sort of economic change. But cricket's quite, I think, is seen by many to have an appeal. There's not much physical contact. That's quite good for allowed the less strong to play, and sort of easier for different social classes to mix, perhaps. There's some clear rules. You've also, in theory, you've got a very sort of clear role for umpires as arbiters. So, for some people, it was seen as a very sort of well-organized game. There's obviously a social aspect to it. You've got meals during the game, after the game, the role of the public house in sort of cricket mythology. And we've already talked about the fact that sort of better off clubs had uniforms and flags and marquees and so on. So it all contributed to quite a sort of smart spectacle. So I think what we see in the 1830s is this sort of developing as part of a sort of, cricket's becoming a bit more respectable, and it's seen as a something that's decent and well organized. I think there's a number of significant developments in the 1830s which actually are important. I think one of the things that I felt in the earlier periods is that a lot of the game grew up in pockets. So you've got the area around Sheffield. You've got sort of a lot of Leeds clubs playing against each other and sort of towns in the broad area. You've got a lot of North Yorkshire towns and villages sort of operating. They don't really play beyond their own sort of areas. There's an area around York as well where there seems to be a lot of cricket played between clubs. I think in the 1830s you start to see connections and linking up between some of these areas. And I mentioned earlier the match between Sheffield Wednesday and Ripon in 1829. That seems to me to be the sort of an important point that two big clubs in different parts of the county now playing each other. So you start to see people travelling more, and I think that the improvements in travel in the 1820s and 1830s, I think that's allowing people to travel further. And there's some quite interesting examples of people travelling quite long distances to play cricket, but also to watch cricket in the 1830s. So quite a lot of Yorkshire people went down to Kent to see Dearman take on Alfred Myn in 1838. You also see there's a little article, I can't remember, in the late 1820s, I think, where there's references to the fact that a lot of people who wanted to go to Sheffield from London actually couldn't get any transport because so many people were going up for the match. And I think again, this would have been a relatively select group of people who were able to afford to do this. But I think when the point is, travel became, I think it became easier. And this is even before railways transformed cricket from the sort of, later in the 1830s and from the 1840s onwards. But there are references, quite a lot of references actually, to clubs hiring coaches or open carriages to take them to matches, and also some lovely descriptions of teams arriving in the town that they were to play, with somebody blowing a horn, and they really wanted to make an impact as they came into town. So I think 1830s, you do see greater linking up of different parts of cricket. It played in different parts. I think the other, crucially, on the field, you see the changes with the development of round-arm bowling, which was spreading throughout the 1830s, diffused quite slowly. And I think, again, one of the really interesting things by this time is the cricket reports become much more detailed, and so you get some quite interesting descriptions of the bowling styles of different players, and also I found a very interesting description of a match in 1834 between York and Ripon, and they go into great detail about the bowling style, and it was quite obvious that not only were different bowlers bowling different styles, some underarm, some round arm, but sometimes they were changing in the course of an innings, or they were changing between innings, so there's references to one bowler bowling with the ball bobbling just sort of swiftly up to the wicket, whilst others are clearly bowling what were described as three-quarter half moon balls, and others were what was described as jerking from the right hip, bringing the right hip forward and projecting the right hip to give the ball some momentum. So you start to, I think, you start to see developments in the bowling. You also see descriptions of much harder hitting, batsmen hitting the ball, much harder. Improvements in field placings as well. People taking it more seriously, not just everybody just spread around, but actually starting to think about, what would be the most effective places. Players starting to take practice more seriously. And I think these things sort of added up to a more attractive spectacle. So I think in the 1830s, you start to see the game emerging as a more of a spectacle, more competitive. Also, quite a lot more references to people complaining about the quality of the field, and it was quite obvious that most cricket at this time was played on just normal field. Many of the fields had real bad reputations for being virtually ploughed fields with lots of ridges, and if it had been raining, there'd be standing water in the ridges and so on. But I think you start to see more criticism and more assumption that actually the game needed to be played on better prepared fields. I think the other interesting thing is actually the development of what I do call in the book a sort of county consciousness. And there's a really fascinating article in the Sheffield Independent, which actually probably one of the best newspapers for cricket, in 1828, and it talks about the need for people who are interested in cricket in the county to get together and to form a county club. And this would be the reason this was necessary, would be to bring together all the best players, and also to try and generate some money so that these best players could be brought together and allowed time to practice. And this is 1828. This is 35 years before Yorkshire County Cricket Club was set up in 1863. So it's quite interesting that there's a sort of, as I say, what I call a county consciousness, where people were thinking not just about their own local area, but sort of thinking about a county cricket club. And I mean, this wasn't totally unusual. There were in different parts of the country there were county clubs starting to develop. But it's interesting that it's happening at this time in Yorkshire, and I think it links up with the point I made about better communication and sort of more linking up between cricketers from different places. I think people started to think beyond, we're the best in our part of the county, and started to think that there was a bigger arena on which they could be playing. So 1828 was that article, and so there was clearly people thinking about this. There were one or two games which are described as being played by teams with the sort of Yorkshire label in the early 1830s, and I sort of think it's part of that same kind of mindset. But it isn't until 1833 that a Yorkshire county team plays Norfolk, but I think it's important, and it goes back to the point I made right at the beginning about why 1833. I think that match between Yorkshire and Norfolk didn't just come out of nowhere. It actually came out of a sort of several years of people thinking about this and matches being played by sort of groups of players who were from more than one club. What's interesting though is Yorkshire played Norfolk a couple of times in 1833. I think they played in 1834 as well. They played Sussex in 1835, and then they played Norfolk again in 1836. These were really, in 1836 was a financial disaster, and the organizer put out an advert in the newspaper and said that I've not been able to cover expenses. And you don't see any county matches, anything under this sort of Yorkshire county label now until the 1840s. And I think it was probably a bit of a wake-up call, and I think it was expensive. I think maybe it's something about the fact that Yorkshire is such a big county. It was expensive to bring people from different parts of the county together, which helps to explain perhaps why so many of the players in the Yorkshire county team were also Sheffield people. In fact, often the labels Sheffield and Yorkshire were used interchangeably. But I think where they tried to bring in people from elsewhere in the county, it was expensive. They also, I think, by the 1830s, they realised that you couldn't just turn up and go and play cricket in one of these games. You actually had to spend some time practicing. I think it was noticed that Sussex, they spent quite a lot of time playing together and practicing together in advance of matches, and that was sort of, people realised actually you needed to do that. But that was expensive, and also, you needed to not only bring people and put them up, but then you also probably needed to somehow compensate them for whatever loss of income they would have had. So I think that's probably why the county game as such, kind of ground to a halt until the 1840s. But the 1830s, I think it's just really important. Again, though, I would say that my caveat to that point is that actually the newspapers just become a lot more detailed in the 1830s. So you get a sense of more nuance, and there's just more information about what is happening compared with previous decades. So it's sort of dangerous to sort of perhaps get it completely out of perspective. But I do think these are significant changes in how the game was organised.
All right, we've done the 1820s and the 1830s, which of course leads us naturally to the 1840s. By which time cricket was very well established in Yorkshire. Would you elaborate on that point and outline any obstacles to its continued entrenchment?
As I say, I think the 1830s was important, but I think the game does sort of drive on from there. And I was interested in as you know, the book sort of cuts off in 1846. So the focus really. In the 1840s, I do feel that the game, in many ways, has sort of gone from just a sport to being increasingly part of Yorkshire life. and a sort of a feature of Yorkshire society increasingly by the 1840s. And by that I mean, you know, it features in schools. So it's a sort of, you know, there are people learning the game, and certainly in the sort of schools which are actually you know, charging a fee. And I wouldn't necessarily use the sort of word public school here, but those that were actually you know, advertising and trying to attract people. You know, the fact that they have cricket fields and the fact that cricket is played is being mentioned in adverts. You also see it in the courts and reports on proceedings in courts, because and it goes back to the point about sort of attempts to control the game and sorry, to control sports. You start to see in the newspapers references to groups of boys being brought in front of magistrates to because they've been caught playing cricket in certain places, for example, on the roads, and they tried to clamp down on cricket on the roads, because often boys used to build wickets out of stones and then leave them on the road, and then obviously there were no street lights at night, and somebody would be coming through on a horse and cart and would hit this great mound of stones. Damage to property, you know, damage to trees, and so on. Playing in places that you know, people did not want sports played. So you see references to groups of boys up in front of magistrates, which sort of, you could see that attempts are being made to sort of control the spread of the game and to have a bit of discipline about where it's played. I think it's increasingly visible in the newspapers as a sort of feature of different parts of the local community. So you see, you know, cricket clubs organising balls. You see, you know, references to events by cricket clubs. So I do see the 1840s increasingly as a sort of time in which the game is spreading and its tentacles and becoming part of Yorkshire society. There's a big expansion of clubs in this period as well, and you know, more clubs with more than one 11, clubs with junior 11s, just lots of different types of organisation setting up cricket clubs. So, you know, yes, public houses are probably traditional places, but, you know, things like literary institutes, lots of workplaces. Cricket was a feature of lots of day trips. And you also see over time, you know, I think a lot of these clubs were very fragile. You know, a lot of the clubs in the first sort of few decades of the 19th century were very fragile. So, you know, the game would survive. It was probably dependent upon a small number of, you know, key players. And then maybe they got old, or maybe they moved and they stopped playing, and then, you know, they weren't replaced. And so the game just disappears in certain towns. And then you see it revived. And there's quite a lot of references in the 1840s to places like Beverley and Helmsley, I think, and Ripon and so on, where the game had been kind of quite prominent maybe in the 1820s and 1830s, and then a different generation had allowed the game to sort of decline. And then suddenly, you know, there's a fanfare of trumpets in the local paper, because, you know, the club has been revived, and we're going to restore the glory days of the 1820s and so on. So, you know, you do see that. And I think then a lot of those clubs probably set themselves up on a more stable basis and probably lasted longer. So I think the early 1840s, you see enhanced fixture lists, longer fixture lists, better organised fixture list. One or two newspapers, the Leeds Times, for example, sort of becomes a bit of a clearinghouse for clubs. And I think a lot of clubs probably found it difficult to organise fixtures, but Leeds Times sort of provided a service whereby it basically would help to bring clubs together and allow them to sort of secure fixtures. I think, you know, increasingly a lot of these cricket clubs developed sort of their sort of rituals, you know, sort of early season practices, end of season balls and annual general meetings. I think things became more formalized. You know, more clubs had officials and rules and accounts, and
there are lots of, more money was spent on things like, the club tent with its flags and all the rest of it. So I just think, you start to see the game being better organized. Certain clubs were lucky enough to have sort of, aristocratic support from local local people who put money into the club, and backed specific clubs, and those became kind of quite prestigious. You see Leeds and Bradford really kind of developing. And I think probably one thing I should have mentioned in the 1830s, but which is now kind of increasingly important in the 1840s, is although Sheffield was the only place that had enclosed grounds in the 1820s, actually in the 1830s there was an enclosed ground at York in 1834, Leeds, the opening of the Victoria ground in 1838, and then Bradford in 1839 had an enclosed ground. And I think in the 1840s that was really important for allowing the game in these places to sort of develop. They were able to charge fees to admission fees to come to a game. There was more money being generated in the game, and I think that was really important. It allowed clubs to be on a much stronger financial setting. It allowed them to employ a professional. Therefore, they improved the standards of their play. So I think that was a crucial step from the late 1830s, which sort of really influenced the development of the game in the 1840s in some of these places. And you start to get some quite big crowds in Leeds and Bradford for games. And what you do see in the early 1840s onwards is a whole sort of series of competitive matches between places like Leeds and Bradford and Sheffield Wednesday and Knaresborough, Yarm, Harewood, and so on. Possibly, Rochdale also in Lancashire involved as well. Start to see major club matches being played in front of quite big crowds, and a very competitive style of cricket. And I think that's a sort of important development. And I think you also start to see other signs of increasingly competitive cricket. York Cricket Club in 1844 and 1845 established a sweepstake competition, which they invited other clubs to come and play. That's I think an interesting development. A competitive semi-finals and final competition. And although it didn't actually mean anything, you do see quite a lot of references in the newspapers to this match is for the Championship of Yorkshire. And this is, I think it's a clear sign by this time that cricketers were kind of conscious or interested in how they stood against others, and who was the best in the area and who were the challengers. So I think you get an expansion of the game, you get more competitive cricket, you get better organized clubs, and also the game has sort of dispersed and sort of influenced and shaped wider society. It's become very visible. And so the argument really of the book is that a lot of these developments had been going on, and so by the time the All England 11 arrived in 1846, the game was pretty much a feature of Yorkshire life. And the only thing I would say, though, at this stage is I think there are a number of obstacles to the game as it was organized at this time progressing. And I think there's three features of that which I talk about in the book. One is I think there's limited money in the game. I think only a few clubs have got enclosed grounds. Only a few clubs are able to sort of seriously charge people and for attendance at matches. The game is still pretty much a very low level, at a very low level of development generally. So there's a limited amount of money in the game, and I think the fact that Yorkshire they were struggling to have Yorkshire County matches. The fact that it was expensive to bring people together, these are sort of it's a limitation. I think there's a lack of leadership. I think it's interesting that Sheffield dominated Yorkshire cricket, but actually in the early 1840s, Sheffield was struggling a bit. They suffered some very bad defeats against Nottingham. There was quite a lot of criticism of the state of the Hyde Park ground in the early 1840s. Sheffield was really trying to get its act together, and I think the idea that Yorkshire cricket probably couldn't develop, Yorkshire County cricket couldn't develop without Sheffield, but actually Sheffield at that time wasn't really in a position to sort of take on more of a leadership role in the game. I think that's quite significant, and I think there was aristocratic support, but I don't think any of the sort of aristocratic supporters of local cricket in Yorkshire really had the sort of the intention or the ambition to sort of provide any kind of leadership role, which might have been the kind of leadership role that was expected at the time. So I think there's a lack of leadership, there's a lack of funds, and actually there's probably still a relatively small number of top players. Tom Marsden had died in 1843, and actually probably was never as successful in the 1830s as he had been in the 1820s. Dearman was a big name, but he was now playing his cricket in Rochdale, and there were good players, but actually some of them were having to find were engaged elsewhere. So there was a number of other sort of names in Yorkshire cricket at the time, but they were actually employed in different parts of the country. So although these big games were going on between some of the major clubs, actually most of them only included, say, one or two sort of higher quality players. And so I think the actual quality of this cricket, was a bit restricted because the sort of the top players were spread quite thinly. So I think it's against this background that the impact of the All England 11 arriving is important. What I argue really is, the game was fairly well established in Yorkshire by the mid 1840s, but it needed some kind of new kickstart, some kind of added momentum, because I don't think, as it was currently organised, it was going to sort of continue to develop in as quickly or as effectively as it would have liked, and it needed this sort of injection of some stars from outside, who would come along. So the All England 11, some of the best players of the day come in to play against a district side, and a district side usually of 22 players, or possibly 18 in some cases, but 22 players, local players, possibly with one or two professional cricketers added, and these were games which were clearly spectacles. Lots of people attended, and they were it was exciting. It was a big event. I think one of the important things when you think about sort of Victorian England is probably to remember quite how dull a lot of life was. Something like the arrival of this group of cricketers in town was a big deal, and certainly for the next 20 years, we see real excitement generated by these matches. But I think the All England 11, it provided new momentum to the game in Yorkshire, and I think there's a number of impacts that it had. I think it just demonstrated to cricketers in the county, as it did to cricketers in other parts of the country, the standard of the game that could be reached, and so I think it probably inspired lots of local cricketers to go out and practice, to join clubs, and then that sort of increased interest then probably it did encourage clubs to acquire a professional. And there were people realised that the game could be played at a higher level, and so some clubs acquired a professional, and then of course they were competing against clubs which didn't have a professional, and those clubs would realise that actually they couldn't really compete anymore unless they had coaching of some kind from a player. So they acquired a professional, and actually, particularly in the 1850s, you see a bit of an arms race developing where the clubs sort of realising that to sort of continue to operate, they need to up their game. And one way of doing that is to acquire a professional. And that's why you see an increase in the number of professionals, and that's stimulated by the sort of interest that's generated by the All England 11. I think the other thing, and it goes back to the point about there not being that much money in the game, and a lot of cricket clubs in the 1840s were pretty fragile. They were just getting by. But I think the way in which the All England matches were organised, which was to sort of have sort of ring-fenced funding and probably have people providing guarantees and so on, it helped to avoid the sort of the risk that you organise a match and it has a catastrophic effect on your finances. So I think there are features about the way in which the All England 11 was organised, and it generated an awful lot of interest, and it has a profound impact on cricket in England, and it has a profound impact on cricket in Yorkshire. But I think the sort of the basic point I was probably making in the book is that it had a profound impact, but it was building on existing enthusiasm for the game, which was probably on a scale which I don't think we've probably recognised before. The game was more sophisticated. It was more solidly bedded into Yorkshire life than perhaps we've been conscious of before. And the All England 11 was really able to take advantage of that rather than just stimulating interest in cricket. And one final point I would make is it did strike me, thinking about the All England 11 and the idea of 11 against 22, and the idea of professional players against local amateurs. In a way, it was a bit of a dead end. It lasted, and there was huge enthusiasm for it. And we had, the All England 11 there was the United England 11, and then later on there was the United South of England 11 and other smaller 11s. So this form of the cricket, it was a feature of Victorian life in the 1850s, 60s, and 70s, and so on. But it did die out.
Perhaps not coincidentally with the rise of county cricket.
Well, indeed, but I think it died out. And there are references in the 1860s in matches in Yorkshire that actually people were becoming increasingly bored by something which was essentially exhibition cricket. And also, it was really difficult even for the best batsman to score against 22 fielders. And also the standards of some of the local travelling 11s actually declined. And I think probably as more county cricket became available, this became less a significant sort of work opportunity. So the standards declined, and I think you do get references to crowds declining and people saying that this form of cricket is it's sort of run its course. And I just wonder whether or not, thinking about sort of alternative developments of the game, I do wonder whether it stunted the kind of competitive town-based cricket that was starting to be a feature of Yorkshire cricket in the 1840s. And I think it's interesting in Scores and Biographies, there is a reference in the early 1850s to the fact that actually a lot of those games were starting to not be played, that some of these town clubs, big town clubs in Yorkshire actually couldn't put sides out anymore. And the reason for that was that their players had all become professionals and therefore were dispersed around the country, playing for other clubs as a result of this increased demand for professional cricketers, which had been generated by the All England 11.
You find similar complaints in Australia a couple decades later with the rise of intercolonial cricket and, of course, the Australian 11, which itself was rather itinerant.
Yeah, so I just end up the book by just sort of throwing this out, that I do wonder whether or not the All England 11 idea and the sort of those touring sides that copied the concept, they had a huge impact on the way in which cricket developed in England in the 19th century. But I just wonder whether in fact they might have stunted an alternative direction of travel, which was perhaps a more city-based, very competitive form of cricket, which was starting to develop in Yorkshire. I mean, that's just it's a sort of alternative history type perspective. But it does strike me that it's not as if anybody plays 11 against 22 cricket anymore, and didn't really do so after the sort of 1870s and 1880s. So I wonder whether or not the concept did have another and perhaps not so positive effect on the development of cricket in Yorkshire.
An especially interesting reflection given the ECB's recent emphasis on city-based as opposed to county-based cricket.
Exactly.
In conclusion, perhaps you'd like to talk a bit about the challenges you faced in putting this book together, this kind of big history, as it were, as distinct from the biographies you've done.
I think, the obvious challenge with writing about cricket in the 18th century and early 19th century is just the lack of evidence. And, I think we've been blessed by the digitization project in the British Library, which has digitized so many provincial newspapers, and I think allowed for a much more systematic review of the available information about cricket, and so that's a massive plus. Leaving aside that it's almost inevitably going to be a partial sort of evidence base in a number of ways. Obviously, only some people would have bothered to have reported the cricket that they played. Some newspapers and not others would have found space for such a topic. Clearly, some editors thought that this was totally unnecessary thing to be reporting and didn't bother, and said as much in the 1820s and 1830s. So, not all the newspapers have been digitized. So, we have to sort of rely on what is available, and no doubt over the years we'll get a kind of opportunities to sort of refine our understanding of the game. Obviously, the sort of primary material that's available is very limited, and when you do find it, it's of varying value. But I did mention the scorebook of the Beverley and East Riding Cricket Club, which started in 1825, and it's only a small book, but it's beautifully handwritten scores, and that's those sorts of things are incredibly valuable. I think the newspaper coverage is of some value in getting a sense of change over time, but you don't get a huge amount of detail. A lot of the information is very descriptive and not very reflective, and so the reason I read out those two reports about the comparison between the way that players of the late 18th century and the 1830s played was just because they're just so rare to actually have that kind of reflective material. So I think the evidence base is the crucial challenge. I think it's important also to sort of try and work forward rather than look back from what we know now and have certain assumptions. So, for example, I'm not sure that there's anything inevitable about the development of county cricket. I think we know how the game has developed from the 1850s or whatever onwards. We know that county cricket in England is the sort of the sort of crucial unit of organisation. But but I think it's nice to sort of begin at the beginning and work forward and sort of get a sense as to what other directions of travel there were. So I think sort of it's important to avoid sort of imposing our 2022 perspective on the game. So I think those are probably the biggest challenges. It's just trying to get hold of the material and trying to make sense of it, and not sort of making assumptions about the direction of travel, because I do think there were alternative ways in which the game could have developed.
Right, and in conclusion, perhaps you'd like to plug the book, tell viewers and listeners where they might obtain a copy.
Yeah, so the book is A Game Emerging, and it's published by the Association of Cricket Statisticians and Historians. It was published early in the year. It is available via the ACS website, and so that is acscricket, or one word.com, and then I think /publications. But it's it's available there. It's still available. There are copies available, and also available is my book about Yorkshire cricket in the 1920s, which is clearly a topic for another day, but and also a topic where the evidence base is much richer. But that book is also available on the ACS website, and also my book, A Game Taken Seriously, which is the book about the Victorian period, which follows on from the book we've been talking about today. All three of them are available still, and in fact they are available at a sort of discount price as a bundle.
Right, and links to the appropriate portions of the website will be posted in the description of this episode. Will there be a fourth book, by the way?
So there is a fourth. There was already a fourth book, which is the one on the First World War, which unfortunately is sold out, which is why I didn't advertise its existence. That one looked at how the game actually survived the First World War and recovered thereafter, but that is sold out. I think in my mind there are potentially three others. There is one which I am sort of thinking about at the moment, which is looking at the 1930s and 40s, which I sort of see as the period when I guess county cricket was perhaps as visible and as popular as it's ever been and is ever likely to be. The other two books, which I sort of are perhaps no more than glints in my eye, is the period between 1893 and the First World War, which is, I guess, the golden age, or one of the golden ages of Yorkshire cricket, which is the sort of period of Hurst and Hawke and Rhodes and so on. I guess in many ways has probably been covered quite extensively, and so isn't a period I've looked at yet. But that is a gap at the moment in the history. And the other gap is really looking from the 50s up to the present day. I sort of think there might be that's a sort of interesting time period, as sort of, perhaps includes some of the the 60s, obviously one of the great periods of Yorkshire cricket, and then a sort of, I guess, a period of much less success through to the present day. And I think there's some interesting themes there, but these are not things that I'm actively thinking about at the moment. It's quite a time-consuming task. So they're things for the future, or possibly never.